Hi guys, today we're talking about core concepts of strength and conditioning. And for some of you this may be a really sort of bare bones review and old news, but for a lot of what we're going to be talking about in the program from here on out, it's extremely important that we know the terms and concepts that we're covering in this today. So a few terms that are sort of thrown around that are related to what we do in a weight room or in an attempt to grow strength or muscle mass. Resistance training, strength training, and weight training. Are all these terms the same? Is there overlap? What do they actually mean? With resistance training, this is any type of training in which the body must move in some direction against some type of force that resists the movement. Resistance training is actually an umbrella term that can include lifting free weights, machines, using resistance bands or chains, or even digging a hole out in the yard. Or finding something that provides resistance, could even be jumping in the swimming pool and moving against the resistance of the water. Strength training, any type of training that involves the body moving in some direction against a force that specifically induces changes in muscle strength or hypertrophy growth. And again, take note that hypertrophy, for our purposes, will always be used relating to muscular growth. And strength training, again, we have a goal, but how we're achieving that goal, it can be done with a variety of movements. It could be manual resistance with another partner, could be using body weight exercises, free weights, machines, you name it. Basically anything that you're doing to improve your strength. And weight training is any type of training in which the body moves in some direction against force that resists the movement and is supplied by some type of weight. So this is a little bit more of our stereotypical fitness center or obviously weight room activities where we're lifting free weights or machines or possibly some type of fun atypical movement like a tire flip or a sandbag curl or clean, kettlebell work, you name it. So all three terms are extremely similar and have a lot of overlap as well. Our basic definition of strength is maximal amount of force muscle or muscle group can generate in a specified movement pattern at a specified velocity or speed of movement. Several more terms that we should all know. Because when we talk about strength, there's different classifications and there's really different meanings to it. And you might notice that some people are extremely strong if you give them 5 or 10 seconds to lift a weight and to see how they do with that. And other people might be better at maybe lifting that weight a little bit faster, or they could lift that weight for more repetitions. Just like different people have these different skill sets, we're going to talk a little bit more about how to label those skill sets and those abilities. Absolute strength, the maximum amount of force that a muscle can produce when all inhibitory and protective mechanisms are removed. So this is rarely seen. Because of this, it is rare that a person can actually demonstrate his or her absolute strength. It takes place under extreme measures, emergency, under hypnosis, with certain ergogenic aids, aka drugs. So absolute strength, this is something that we're not commonly going to measure in a weight room. And honestly, of all the definitions we're talking about today, this is probably the least important. Even though this is when we're at our strongest, it's just not something that we deal with on a regular basis. So think about every once in a while in a news story, you'll see something about sort of your average Joe lifting a car up off somebody that is trapped under it, whether it was from a car accident or they were changing a tire and the jack slipped or something along those lines. Or if you see something in the news where someone was using some type of stimulant, and their nervous system is firing at a very extremely high level. And when police officers try to restrain them, sometimes it's really difficult because they're exhibiting absolute strength, and there's not a lot of inhibition there. And if you ever just visit a weight room or watch someone who is preparing to lift an extremely heavy weight, they might psych themselves up and they'll listen to maybe some rock music or some really loud music, and they might even take use of some smelling salts. And these things will help reduce inhibitions and allow them to lift more weight. But it's just not something we're going to see on a regular basis. It will probably not fall into our area of expertise. How about maximal strength? So now this is a little bit more in our field. Maximal strength is the force of a muscle or muscle group that can produce in a specific exercise for one repetition. This is also referred to as a 1 rep maximum or a 1 RM. And some estimates are that the 1 RM is actually only about 80% of absolute strength. And what type of sport and activities is this important for? So with our 1 RM, the most clear answer that this activity is important for would be a power lifter who competes in the events of a squat, bench, and deadlift, an Olympic weightlifter who competes in the snatch and the clean and jerk, maybe some CrossFit athletes, depending on what events are at the competition that day. But then when we get away from the barbell and away from some of that true strength training or strength expression, now we're going to look at athletes that are more like maybe a wrestler who's putting their hands on another individual, and they need to express strength, and it becomes important. How about a track and field thrower who is attempting to kind of hurl a weight as far as they can? But when we're talking about maybe a marathon runner, a triathlete, a soccer player, a ballet dancer, maximal strength can still be important and can still help them, but it is no longer as relevant as it may be for a wrestler or a lineman on a football team. Relative strength, this is comparing our ability to produce strength in comparison to our own body weight. So with relative strength, is the strongest person in the weight room the 300-pound individual who can also bench press 300 pounds? Or is it the 150-pound individual who can bench press 250 pounds? Because one athlete is bench pressing, the 300-pounder is bench pressing their body weight, so it's a 1-to-1 ratio. Whereas our 150-pound athlete who's bench pressing 250 pounds, well, now this is a ratio of 3-to-5. So they're significantly stronger when it comes to relative strength than the 300-pounder who has the greater maximal strength. This would be important for nearly every sport, but particularly for sports that have weight classes. Our wrestlers, equestrian, horseback riding, and I can't think of a sport that this is not important for. I don't necessarily want my athletes to be as strong as possible if they're just adding on extra fat mass to achieve that extra strength. We want our athletes to be functional and to just be the appropriate weight and strength for their position. So don't be afraid to gain weight if your sport requires it, but we don't want to do it just for the sake of getting strength that does not improve our relative strength. About speed strength, the ability to move the body or an object quickly, aka power. What sport and activity is this most important for? There's probably less sports that's not important for than sports that it is important for. I would take power for my wrestlers, my swimmers, my football players, my track team, my basketball team. Yeah, we like power. We like the ability to move weight and move it quickly. Starting strength is your ability to generate a sharp rise in power during the initial phase of a movement. And what sports or activities is this important for? Well, the first one that comes to mind is football. In football, the whole team is lined up and their feet are still. And then with the movement of the ball, they are challenged to move as quickly as possible into whatever their activity is, whether it's guarding the quarterback or streaking downfield and trying to evade a defender. But I like my starting strength for my football team. But really, anytime, let's say it's soccer, are they changing direction? Is there a turnover and now they have to turn and run the other way? Well, at some point, if I'm running in this direction and I have to stop and turn and run back, at some point in that activity, I'm completely frozen and I have to restart my activity. And so that starting strength transfers over into our ability to move our bodies and be reactive on our sport, on our field of sport. Acceleration strength, again, after that starting strength, once the first step or two is taken in the new direction that an athlete is moving in, your acceleration strength will help us produce force and move on. And all of these are measurable in the weight room on the barbell, actually. Endurance strength, the ability to maintain force production for a longer time or through multiple repetitions of an exercise. And think about the fact that maybe two athletes both bench press 200 pounds. Well, one athlete might bench press 150 pounds for 10 reps, and the other athlete might bench press 150 reps for 12 reps. That would be an example of endurance strength. And what sport or activity is this important for? Again, if you're in a sport where fatigue is relevant, this will help you. So maybe not as much for track and field, where your events are predetermined, but it's not going to hurt to have endurance strength. It just wouldn't be your top focus. But for any sport where fatigue becomes a factor, I would encourage you to maybe pay some attention to endurance strength. And before we move on, let's talk a little bit more about the strength classifications that we just went through. Let's jump back a few slides. Okay, here we go. So if we look at this, let's just look at sort of a simple pyramid. At the top here are our absolute strongest, be absolute, but we don't really get to access that. That doesn't really fall into what we're going to see on a typical basis in a weight room. And it's really reserved for emergency settings or people who are maybe employing some drugs or who are kind of revving them up into almost like a state of psychosis almost. So we're not going to worry about that absolute strength, but we are going to talk about that max strength. And with that max strength, there are those who believe, and the logic is there, it's not a bad idea, there are those who believe that your max strength has a trickle-down effect onto all the other levels of strength. So the higher your maximal strength is, the better our relative strength is, the better our speed strength is, the better our starting strength is, the better our acceleration strength is, and the better our endurance strength is. Because the higher our maximal strength is, this then sort of allows for a lot of times I'll look at maximal strength as the top floor of a building, and all the other strengths are the elevators within a building. So the higher that building is, the higher the elevators can go. Now, one thing to keep in mind, we'll talk about this more in just a moment, is that training max strength and really focusing on it, it has a rate of diminished returns. Just training max strength will improve max strength, and it will typically improve everything underneath it. But if I've got a If I've got a cross-country runner, I'm probably going to spend a little bit more time training endurance strength than I am max strength. If that fits into the program with the other coaches and what we believe is appropriate. If I have a track and field thrower, I want their maximal strength as high as possible because that's going to translate really well into their sport. But I also want them to move quickly. They have a limited amount of time to go through their rotations and to produce their throw. And so working their speed strength and their starting strength and their acceleration strength, sort of maybe down in these categories, that's not a bad idea either. And we're going to learn more about how to do that. Let's get back through these. All right, keep in mind that our muscles only do one thing. Our muscles only contract. They only shorten. But there's three types of contractions: concentric, eccentric, and isometric. Our concentric contraction is when muscle force exceeds external resistance, resulting in the joint movement as the muscle shortens. So consider an individual grabbing a 10-pound dumbbell, and they're going to perform a bicep curl. With 9 pounds of force being produced by that bicep, the weight will not come up. With 10 pounds of force being produced by the muscle, the weight will not come up. With 11 pounds of force being produced by the muscle, the weight will finally come up. And during concentric contractions, muscle fibers will shorten while contracting to lift a weight. And this is the most commonly used limiting factor for strength training. So there's one thing that I want you guys to keep in mind, is that one thing we can do to advance our own programming for ourselves, for people we're helping out, whether they're clients, athletes, or friends, family, whoever it is that maybe not every set of every exercise needs to be limited by your concentric abilities. And we'll get into that as we talk about the other contraction types. How about our eccentric contraction? Our scientific definition would be that the external resistance exceeds the force supplied by the muscle, resulting in joint movement as the muscle lengthens. Let's go back to our bicep curl. If we've got the weight at the top now, and it's 10 pounds, as soon as the weight exceeds the force being produced by the bicep, it's going to go back down. In layman's terms, the muscle fibers lengthen with a high external load. So although our muscle fibers are attempting to contract, because we're producing less force than the external load is, they will actually lengthen while they're attempting to contract. So it's not that they are relaxing or that the antagonist muscle is contracting. It's just that they're not producing enough force. So that even though they are firing and attempting to shorten, the external force causes them to lengthen. And this can be done intentionally. Sometimes it happens unintentionally. So consider a squat. On a squat, our eccentric action occurs on the way down, and our concentric contraction occurs on the way up. Now, if we've done so many reps that we fail concentrically, which is typically the first place that we'll fail, because concentric contractions are the weakest of the three muscle contractions. Once we fail concentrically and we're squatting and we're coming up, and maybe we just can't finish that squat on the way up, but maybe we come up and we pause and we're fighting, and then we start controlling down. If we can control it down, even though we can no longer send it upward or hold it stable, if we can control it down, that's an eccentric contraction or an eccentric rep that has occurred sort of unintentionally. If we squat 300 pounds and we put 330 pounds on the bar, a weight we know that we're not going to stand back up with, what you might do is you might set your safety columns on the squat rack so that you can unrack 330 from the top and then control 330 and fight it, and then just set it down on the bars beneath you. Or have 2 or 3 spotters come over and just tell them ahead of time, hey, I'm not planning on standing back up with this. I just want to really cause this stress and perform this negative rep or eccentric contraction. And so we all understand that now the weight is not going to naturally come back up. It's going to be all hands on deck to get it back up. But then you might take that 330 pounds out of the rack, initiate your squat, and then fight it on the way down. So that would be an intentional eccentric rep or negative contraction. And our isometric contraction, this is our concentric contraction is the weakest of the 3. And then our isometric contraction is the second weakest of the 3. And then our eccentric contraction is the strongest of the 3. So our isometric contraction occurs, iso in Latin means same, and metric in Latin means length. So same length. When we perform an isometric contraction, our muscles will remain the same length. And think about maybe a wall sit where an individual puts their back against the wall and their joints are fixed in a position and they're working against that load of the wall and their body weight. That's an isometric contraction. If you've ever done it and you felt the burn in your legs to the point that your legs are starting to wobble and shake from fatigue, you know that it can be extremely hard despite the fact that you're not moving. So an isometric contraction has benefits. There's plenty of good work that can be done there. It can cause great stress on the muscles. A big downside there is that you're going to get strong at the angle that you train at, but it doesn't have a whole lot of carryover into some of the other angles. And that isometric contraction, let's go back to our squat. That isometric contraction takes place once our feet are fixed and we're in place and we're standing up. There's an isometric contraction there because there's no movement, but we are under load. And then we might eccentrically lower the bar as we're squatting, pause the bottom for another isometric contraction, and then initiate the concentric contraction to come back upward. Is one type of muscle action more important to train than the others? No, I don't think so. I would say that the isometric and the eccentric contractions are most often neglected. If I could do one thing different from my first several years of training, not only myself, but others, if I could do one thing different, it would be to better employ isometric and eccentric contractions, because all of the training of my athletes and my clients was limited by concentric contractions. Once they concentrically failed, I was like, okay, the set's over. That's pretty much it. I would occasionally do some eccentrics, but it was rare. Knowing what I know now, I employ them on a regular basis, and I utilize them because we're able to tap into the muscles and cause stress at a greater extent than just being limited by our concentric contractions. So concentrically, most of our muscle action in sport has a concentric action. But if we want to improve our training and improve our performance, utilizing isometrics and eccentrics in a weight room or in a practical application setting could boost our performance easily. I believe we've covered all this already. If you want to read through it, pause it and check it out. Voluntary maximal muscle action. When a muscle works against as much resistance as its current fatigue level will allow. Regardless of how many repetitions are performed, whether it be 1 or 10, it is the last repetition when momentary concentric muscle failure is reached. Also referred to as a repetition maximum, or RM. And looking at the 1 RM is a voluntary muscle action with 1 repetition, and the 10 RM is a voluntary maximal muscle action on the 10th repetition. So excuse me for reading off the slide there, guys, but really what we're talking about here is go back to that rant I was going on about all of my training being limited by concentric repetitions. Well, for the most part, that's how we're going to measure ability and performance in the weight room. And when you're looking at 1 repetition, and let's stick with the squat, we've been talking about it for a little while now. When you're looking at 1 repetition, it would be the lifter who is able to unrack a bar, take it down to the allowable squat depth, and then return to that standing position 1 time. Once you start attempting to measure isometric abilities and eccentric abilities, it becomes way more convoluted and complicated. So just sticking with the concentric contraction abilities makes measurements for strength much easier. And because a lot of your training will be based off of that, you want it to be simple and you want it to be understandable and measurable. So we don't want to get too crazy and start trying to measure isometric squats to failure or eccentric squats to failure. That's going to be a lot more dangerous and just kind of murky. So sticking to just successful reps that include a positive portion of the rep, aka the concentric contraction, that just makes life easier. And we're also introducing a different idea here, is that you can work out, you can do a maximal set. It doesn't have to be with only 1 rep. If you're a 200-pound squatter, your 1 RM is 200 pounds, but your 10 RM might be more like 150 pounds. And on 150 pounds, squatting 150 pounds on that 10th rep, your 10th rep is going to feel as hard and as miserable and as challenging as when you do 200 pounds for 1 rep. They're both your maximal effort reps. They just have different set values on them. Some of our principles for strength training. Principle of specificity, aka the SAID principle. And our SAID principle indicates that specific adaptations to impose demands occur. So if I haven't been to a batting cage in years, which I haven't, if I went tonight, I'd probably get some calluses on my hands because I'm not used to it. My hands aren't used to that activity. If I haven't been on a run for years and I go out and I take a big run, I'm probably going to get some blisters, right? So going out and doing a certain activity is going to be the stimulus, and how our bodies adapt is how our bodies respond is our adaptation, excuse me. So let's look back at the run. If I haven't gone on a run for a long time and I go out for a small jog, I might get a couple of sore spots. If I go out for some heaping like 15-mile extravaganza, I'm probably gonna get some pretty bad blisters. If I start running regularly at moderate distances, I'm probably going to get calluses, right? So maybe my batting cage analogy earlier, where I get calluses after one night, it'd probably be more like blisters. The principle of progressive overload. We're going to continually increase the intensity and or volume of the workout as the muscle becomes accustomed to the current training level. So think back one slide to our SAID principle. If we go out and do a small run, our body's going to adapt a little bit, and that might allow us to do a longer run the following event, or maybe after several small runs, we can work up to a longer run, or we can go out on that small run, maybe a mile, let's say, but the next time we might do that mile a little bit faster. And in this way, we cause progressive overload. And progressive overload is one of the major foundational principles missing from most people's programs. When you see people going to the gym and doing the same thing over and over again and expecting their bodies to change, they're missing progressive overload. If just general workload was enough to change our body, then you would see that every guy who worked construction would look like Brad Pitt or something. Like, they'd be shredded, right? Because they're out there doing manual hard labor. But because they go out and they do that work and they adapt to it, then once they're done adapting to it and they're just working the normal day, there's no new stimulus, so there's no new adaptation. The same thing goes for our stay-at-home moms. If our stay-at-home moms were, think about a mother of 1 or 2 or 3 who's chasing kids around, and I'm doing some stereotypes here, so forgive me if I'm offending anybody here. But if our stay-at-home mom or parent or whoever, if they're chasing around 1 or 2 or 3 kids and they're doing a bunch of laundry and they're cleaning the house, and I'm a father of 2, and I know that the laundry and the dirt and the messes, they rack up really quickly. If there was no progressive overload, anybody who's staying at home and watching 1 or 2 or 3 kids on a regular basis would just be in phenomenal shape because it's challenging. But when there's no progressive overload, your body adapts a little bit and then it's done adapting. We have to find ways to challenge at a higher level and cause a new stimulus, and that will in turn cause a new adaptation. And a simple story of that is the a little bit of mythology is the story of Milo of Croton. So the story goes is that a young boy is given a young bull, and he lives in this village, and his village is at the bottom of a mountain, and there's a spring with clean water at the top of the mountain. And as the boy has this young bull and he's got to get it to water, well, the bull doesn't know to climb up the mountain, so Milo will grab him around the legs and hug him up to his chest, hike up the mountain. And Milo does this every day. And as time goes on, the bull grows. But because Milo has been consistently working with that bull and carrying it up the mountain once, maybe twice a day, Milo also grows. And eventually he's a man carrying a full-grown bull up the mountain to get water. Is this true? Probably not. Bulls seem like they're really hard to carry, and they're pretty dang heavy. But the story has value for us right now. And since I'm getting a little bit of a tickle in my throat, I'm going to drink water myself. The principle of individuality. Training programs must consider the specific needs of goals and abilities of a person for whom it is designed. Are they a noob or are they a veteran? Male or female, tall or short, soccer player or football player? Their biological age, not just their chronological age. Because sometimes I see 20-year-old athletes that are in phenomenal shape. They look like they're almost ready to do bodybuilding shows, but they're terrible in the weight room. They don't know what's going on. They just look the part. And I have to start with them with the basics. Whereas other times I have 17-year-olds who have been training under high-level coaches for several years, and they're phenomenal in the weight room. And I don't need to work on the basics with them. So you have to take into account what you've got, who you're working with. So a quick story on this would be during the summer of 2012, I was an intern strength coach with the University of Missouri football team. And these guys really pride themselves on lifting big weights. And the squat, the bench, the hang clean, these were all extremely important. They measured all of them. They measured their jumps, their sprints. They were very big on data and metrics. And during that same summer, I was able to go down to Baylor and work with their football team in the strength conditioning capacity. And what they valued was tempo and speed and effort and a rapid high pace. And was this because they played in different conferences? Maybe. They played the same sport. Was this because the strength coaches had different beliefs? Was this because they were in different states? What was it? Well, it was that the head coaches had different demands. Gary Pinkel at the University of Missouri told the strength staff, I know that I want the biggest, strongest guys on the team, and I know what numbers I want these guys to be lifting. And you guys, it's your job to make them lift these numbers. Okay, so right then, the strength staff knows what is important. Pardon me. Right then, the University of Missouri staff knows, okay, we're going to train to play football and do their best there. But we also, the head guy says that he wants some big numbers. So we need to put a little bit of a priority on those big numbers. Well, there's a different head coach, Art Briles at the time, down at Baylor. And he told his football strength staff, he said, I want us to push the pace harder than any other team that we're going to face. And so that's what they did. They came in and they ran them, and they gave them a very short break, and they took them into the weight room, and they pushed them hard. They pushed them appropriately, but it looked like they were almost training for an entirely different sport when compared to the University of Missouri football team. And the reason is because the head coaches had different philosophies, and they wanted to play their sport. They wanted to train their teams differently so that they could play them differently. So sometimes you got to know not only who you're working with, but what some of the external factors are. Principle of variation. An effective program only lasts for a little while. Now, you could keep doing that effective program over and over again. But once the stimulus and the adaptation occurs, once you're adapted, you're adapted. So, earlier I was talking about let's take our typical guy who's working at a construction site. Now, if I went and worked at a construction site for a couple of weeks, I would be sore and exhausted every day. But maybe around week 4 or 5, I'd get used to it. And for the first couple of weeks, it'd be a great workout every day. I would almost feel convinced, I'm gonna get shredded and bulky and strong and whatever else, yoked, if you will. But by the 5th week, 7th week, I'm probably not getting sore anymore. My body's going to adapt. And the same thing, if I went from having no children and I suddenly had 2 children, the amount of running around and play, and we get to play a lot, but the amount of running around and cleaning up after them and the extra laundry and things like that, and the early mornings and late nights, it would be exhausting. But because I went through it gradually, I had 1 child and I got exhausted, and then I sort of adapted a little bit, and then we had another one. And so you go through that stimulus and then that adaptation. I like a quote from a coach, Harry Selko, and he says that the best program is the one that you're on, the one that you're doing right now. He says that the best program is also the program that you're not doing right now, the program you need to be doing. And what he means by that is that you have to strength train, and if you want to get stronger or leaner or more endurance or whatever it is, you have to train for it. But you got to know that whatever you're training for, if it's working right now, it's probably not going to work for the next several weeks. You have to change up some things. And so that's our principle of variation, is to make sure that we're implementing changes, whether you're changing movements or your weekly split or the intensity or the volume. Principle of maintenance. This is good news. It takes less work to maintain that level of strength or muscle mass than it did to achieve it. We must work very hard to make changes within the body, but once the changes are made, we can keep them for a lower effort. Principle of reversibility. Now, we don't always get to keep those strength levels. If we quit going to the gym altogether, we're going to decondition and we're going to lose some of those benefits, whether it is conditioning from running or strength from squat workouts. And some of the biggest issues we see with reversibility is that I think it's almost a curse to have a good memory sometimes, because individuals will remember clearly maybe 5 years ago how much they squatted or how much they bench pressed, and they will come in 5 years later after inconsistent or non-existent training, and they will attempt to lift weights similar to how they were 5 years ago, and they get hurt. And the same thing goes for maybe a conditioning workout. Is they go out planning on a big run, and about 45 seconds into it, they just hit walls and have issues there. So I would say probably the number one issue I see with that would be lower back strains in the weight room. Is we need to rebuild their foundation instead of just them saying, "Oh, I used to be pretty strong a few years ago." Don't take people's word for it. I often see 20-year-olds who look like they're in fantastic shape and that they know their way around the weight room, and they don't. And almost every male athlete that I have will lie to my face about how much they bench press. For whatever it is, we care a lot about the bench press, even though it's a very sort of silly and non-productive exercise. Guys will just lie about their bench press for whatever reason it is. So my ladies tend to have a little bit more integrity, and they don't really care with the bench press. They'll just tell you how much they do, and that's the end of it. Resistance training goals: power, strength, hypertrophy, muscular endurance. And there's a lot of terms and lingo that sort of jumps away from these. And what we do with resistance training can help us do a lot of other things on the sporting field away from resistance training. But when we are resistance training in this program, that's basically what we're going to talk about: power production, strength, hypertrophy, and muscular endurance. So with power, what is power? Power is work over time. That's the equation. What is work? Work is force times distance. So let's look at our throwers on the track team. However many kilograms, whatever implement they're throwing, and they have, with the movement they're attempting to do, it might take them around 1 second to complete that movement. And then we look at how far they throw. And so we have the amount of work they've done is the force of the weight multiplied by the distance that it traveled. And then you would divide it over the time that it took them to produce that force to complete their throw from start to finish. And so that's going to be in that strength speed category, sort of in the middle of that curve there. And if we're in the weight room and it's a heavy squat day and the music's blaring and we're kind of being meatheads and like headbanging a little bit and getting ourselves psyched up and getting ready to lift heavy, when we go and get under, maybe we've squatted 300 pounds before and now we're going for 315 pounds. We've never done it before. And we take it down, we eccentrically load, maybe get a little baby isometric pause, but really just kind of come back up, and we're concentrically coming up. On that concentric movement, it's probably going to be really slow. We're talking about a heavier weight than we've ever done before. It's not just going to ricochet at the bottom there. And then 315 pounds is a good amount of weight to a lot of people. That weight is probably going to be traveling. If let's say we complete the rep and we barely complete it, that weight is probably going to be traveling 1.3 meters per second or slower. Sorry guys, I just totally got tongue-tied. For that same heavy squat I was just talking about, I read off the graph wrong. I apologize about that, guys. So let's look down towards the bottom of the graph. For that max or absolute strength, that heavy squat on the way up is going to be moving 0.5 meters per second or slower. Now let's go back to what I was talking about earlier. I was mistakenly talking about starting strength or max speed. So let's say we successfully hit that 315-pound squat and we take off all the weight and we're just working with a 45-pound bar. And maybe we're doing just 45-pound bar squats. Well, that's going to be much faster. It's going to be, the meters per second on it will absolutely be 1.3 meters per second or greater. And that's our starting strength or our max speed, which I mistakenly kind of tripped up a second ago. So we need to know that as we look at that curve there, you can be strong, you can have better absolute strength, or better maximal strength, and that's going to be your ability to move heavy weights slowly. And you also have the ability to have better starting strength or max speed, and that's your ability to move lighter weights quickly. And people with the same absolute and max strength where they move slowly, if they have the same 300-pound squat, 500-pound squat, or whatever, they can have different sub strengths. So they might be able to move that bar, that 45-pound bar. One person might move it faster than the other, even though they have the same maximal strength. Again, kind of going back to our little pyramid back here, two athletes with the same maximal strength up here may have very different starting strength or max speed. So our maximal force that a muscle or muscle group can generate at a specified velocity. So looking back at our strength force curve right here, depending on how fast you're moving, you fall in a different category. And you can train that different category of different speed. Only problem is you kind of need an accelerometer or something to measure the velocity. Hypertrophy. So this is again our muscle size. We're training maybe for a little bit more bodybuilding. The nice thing that is with larger muscles, we tend to get stronger as well. So it's not just wasted mass. So if you ever see maybe our weightlifting team, they spend a lot of time squatting, and they also spend a lot of time wearing the skin tight uniforms and competition singlets. And so you get a good chance to look at their thighs, and you'll tend to see that they've got pretty big thighs and glutes on them. Muscular endurance. If we look at our time under tension, how long a set actually takes, that muscular endurance tends to get developed around the 60-second marker. So longer sets with lighter weights tend to be where we develop our muscular endurance. In this chart, I don't expect you guys to memorize this chart right now, but know that we're going to see it over and over again. And so I just want to expose you to it real quick, is that for different training goals, whether you train for strength or power with a single event or power with multiple event or hypertrophy or muscular endurance, whatever you're training for, your goal determines your training. And the goal is to keep the goal the goal. So whatever we're training for, the research has been done. There's been a couple of generations of meatheads and scientists and research that have been looking into this for a long time. And so we don't have all the answers, but we have a pretty good foundation for where we can go. So if I want to get stronger, I'm going to start lifting. I'm going to do a lot of my lifts with 85% and above of my 1 rep max. If I want to get better hypertrophy, a lot of my sets are going to take place between 67 and 85% of my one rep max. And then my goal repetitions with those weights is going to vary as well. And the sets that I use them with, the rest period in between, and the optimal time under tension. So that TUT is time under tension. So think about hypertrophy is about 40 to 60 seconds. So that way you're using a weight that's heavy enough to be stimulating, but light enough that you can do a lot of reps. And a lot of those reps would put you into those 40 to 60 second windows. You want to cause stress on those muscles, fill them up with blood and fluid, and keep picking on them. And then you take a relatively small break, and then you go back in and do it again if you're training for hypertrophy. If you're training for strength, you take big long breaks of 2 to 5 minutes because you want your ATP and creatine phosphate stores to replenish so that you are able to basically have the rocket fuel to lift something heavy again. We will talk about all this and more down the road. If you're interested, pause it now and look through the chart a little bit more. I believe this is our last slide of the day. I want you guys to get familiar with this. This is our relative intensity table. When we are looking at big compound exercises, like a squat, a bench press, a deadlift, a clean, or we can actually use it for quite a few movements. What we're going to do is either test their 1 rep max or do a sub-maximal test of more repetitions. And then we will predict their 1 rep max. And then with that prediction of their 1 rep max, we're then able to do sub-maximal training, because not every time you go into a weight room do you train at 100% effort. So we're going to flip back one level there. So on that second column there, the load, the percent of the 1RM, all of those numbers are just relative to a 100% number of whatever exercise you would be performing. So I'm hoping this sinks in a little bit more. I'm just going to talk on it for a few more seconds. So again, let's say we're a 100-pound bench press max athlete. That means for 1 rep, we can do 100 pounds. On that same exercise, the bench press, for 10 reps, we could probably do 72.5 pounds. And that 10th rep at 72.5 pounds would look excruciating and challenging, and it would be kind of a slow grinder, very similar to how 100 pounds for 1 rep looked on that bench press. We're going to talk a lot more about that, but I suggest you guys spend some time looking at this chart now, especially some of the recommendations off to the right, and start understanding that the color coding is that our red levels at the top are extremely stressful. We're not going to live there. We're not going to train maximally every time we go into a weight room. And then as the sort of the little color coding comes down, we're getting into an easier and safer training zones. And that actually matches up quite well with that force velocity curve we had earlier, is that the lower on this chart you go, the faster you're able to move weights. And so you'd be higher on that force velocity curve that we were looking at earlier, where I had my little, I inverted where the max strength and max speed were at. Awesome, guys. We covered a lot of material today. I know it's kind of like drinking, water out of a fire hose, but a lot of this is to just build our foundation, but also just to familiarize you guys with the concepts that we're talking about, so you can be successful as the program carries on from here on out. Great. See you next time.